One morning, as you left home for work, you looked at your gas gauge. There was still fuel in the tank, but the long queue outside the station whispered a much harsher truth. This time, the problem wasn't you. That fear, which anyone could experience, silently choked you. America was in crisis again, but this time, no one knew how deep it was. As 1979 approached, life in old America was already fragile. The wounds of the first oil crisis of 1973 hadn't fully healed, and while people were trying to get used to the price tags, a new wave was approaching. In those days, television screens were reporting on events in a distant land, Iran, street protests, a fallen regime, an uncertain future. But no one could have foreseen that this would affect American kitchens, wallets, and patience a few months later. Oil was the invisible backbone of modern America. Cars, trucks, factories, heated homes, everything was built on it. And when the world's oil supply suddenly dwindled with the Iranian Revolution, ordinary people became the weakest link in the chain. But what was truly shocking was that it wasn't felt overnight, but gradually. In the first few days, people only noticed that prices were rising. Then gas stations started closing earlier. Then no gas today signs appeared. No one admitted to panicking, but everyone checked their tanks more often, because there was an unspoken anxiety. America, in those years, still relied on its strength. The idea that this country will overcome every crisis was widespread. But this time, the crisis wasn't coming from Wall Street. It was coming from the highways, the gas pumps, the routines of people going to work in the morning. This was a crisis where habits, not numbers, were disrupted. And people were beginning to feel this wasn't just a price increase. This was a loss of control. The possibility of not being able to start the engine as usual one morning was creating a silent but permanent crack in one's mind. Meanwhile, officials in Washington were speaking, trying to calm the markets, but for the Americans on the street, words weren't enough, because the reality was visible. Queues were getting longer, patience was running out, and trust was eroding unnoticed. No one knew yet that this would be remembered as the second oil crisis. No one was openly talking about how it would reignite inflation, push interest rates higher, and destabilize family budgets. But people felt it, not that something was wrong, that things would never be the same again. This chapter ends here, but the story is just beginning, because in the next phase we will see how this crisis infiltrated daily life and forced people to change their behavior. In old America, people initially tried not to accept the crisis. Even when the queues at gas stations grew longer, most people thought it was temporary. Believing that everything would return to normal in a week or two was the easiest way to cope with the uncertainty. But as the weeks passed, this optimism quietly began to erode. By the summer of 1979, gasoline purchases were restricted in many states. License plate-based driving restrictions emerged. On some days, being able to drive your car depended solely on the last digit of your license plate. This went against the sense of freedom America was accustomed to. For the first time, people had to get used to not being able to drive their own cars whenever they wanted. Waiting in lines became an experience in itself. People would go to the station early in the morning, turn off the engine and wait, sometimes for hours. Sometimes just as it was your turn, they would say, "We're out of gas." This moment was the first encounter with the true face of the crisis for many. People started looking at each other more carefully. Who was trying to cut in line? Who was filling extra jerry cans? Who was getting angry? Who was silent? The crisis revealed not only the economy, but also human behavior. During this period, conversations within the home also changed. The phrase, "Let's use the car less this week," became commonplace. Weekend plans were shortened, visits postponed. Some families began sharing commutes to and from work. The long-forgotten habit of managing was returning in America. But the tension wasn't just individual. Transportation costs were rising, which was reflected in grocery prices. As gasoline became more expensive, everything else became more expensive. People weren't yet expressing it in numbers, but the feeling was very clear. Life was quietly becoming harder. Television news featured experts speaking and graphs being shown, but for someone sitting at home, the graphs meant little. What mattered was how quickly a store was emptying and how slowly a paycheck was filling up. This difference was the kind that gnawed at one's soul. This period was particularly unsettling for middle-aged Americans because they had grown up in post-war prosperity, accepting abundance as normal. Now, for the first time, they saw so clearly that the system could malfunction. This awareness created a silent but profound sense of insecurity. And perhaps most importantly, this crisis wasn't erupting in one place. It was progressing slowly. It was seeping into everyday life. People were changing their habits without realizing it. No one was saying it aloud yet, but the question was circulating in people's minds. If oil is like this, what will be missing tomorrow? By 1979, the old America had not yet fully recovered from the trauma of the first oil crisis. People still remembered the queues at gas stations, the empty pumps, and the soaring prices. Just when everything seemed to be slowly returning to normal, news from the other side of the world began to shake American daily life once again. In Iran, the streets were in turmoil, factories were shut down, and the flow of oil was interrupted. Many at the time saw this as a foreign policy issue, but it soon became clear that this crisis would directly affect American kitchens, cars, and wallets. With the Iranian Revolution, oil production almost came to a standstill. This wasn't just a matter of a few barrels missing. The already delicate balance in the global oil market was suddenly disrupted. For America, Iran was a vital supplier, and this loss was reflected in prices almost immediately. Newspapers ran the same headlines for weeks: new surge, uncertainty, anxiety. But the real impact was felt when these words entered homes. For many families, this period was a time of silent calculation. At dinner, the questions were, should we skip driving tomorrow? Can we skip going anywhere this week? Should we turn down the heating? Gasoline wasn't just fuel, it was the invisible backbone of daily life. From children going to school to fathers rushing to work, from mothers shopping to farmers in rural areas, everyone felt the shock. For the middle class in particular, this crisis was a turning point. People were working, earning money, but that money was buying fewer and fewer things each week. As gasoline prices rose, so did the prices on grocery store shelves. Transportation became more expensive, and every product was affected in a chain reaction. Many in old America realized for the first time that the world was very small, and a political crisis in a distant country could change even the price of their morning coffee. Experts spoke on the television news, graphs were shown, but these explanations meant little to the families sitting at the kitchen table. They were looking at the money left at the end of the month. Some households sold their second cars, some families cancelled summer vacations, and some started taking on debt. Although this period was seen as a temporary hardship in American society, many older Americans still remember that feeling, the slow slipping of control. The situation was no different for young people. Those attending university began looking for part-time jobs because families were struggling to send them allowances. Small businesses shortened their hours or closed down due to rising energy costs. For those living in rural areas, the crisis was even harsher. Oil was the heart of tractors, trucks, and production. As fuel prices increased, the cost of farming rose, but product prices did not increase at the same rate. This second oil crisis created not only financial, but also psychological exhaustion in people. A feeling of again prevailed. Just a few years earlier, they had experienced a similar shock, and now they were facing the same uncertainty again. Trust was eroded. The predictability of the state, the markets, and the future began to be questioned. In old America, this period was marked by an unspoken but palpable anxiety. No one was loudly proclaiming worse is yet to come, but everyone sensed it, because this crisis wasn't just an energy problem. It fueled inflation, pushed interest rates higher, and slowly eroded the public's patience. And many people didn't yet realize it, but the stones thrown during these years were laying the groundwork for the far more severe economic hardships of the early 1980s. That silence, beginning with Iran, reverberated in America for a long time. This reverberation signaled not only the weakening of fuel pumps, but also the erosion of public trust. As the effects of the second oil crisis deepened, the problem in old America was no longer confined to the gas stations. Queues were just the surface. The real story was being written inside homes, workplaces, and in people's minds. By late 1979, many Americans sensed that the crisis was no longer temporary. This wasn't a few months of hardship. It was a long period of contraction that was slowly changing the rhythm of life. Going to gas stations had become a source of stress in itself. People set out early in the morning, waited for hours, and sometimes found the pumps closed when it was their turn. This created anger, but even more so, it left a feeling of exhaustion. No one wanted to shout. Everyone was simply trying to get to work, home, and their responsibilities. This silent weariness was the most prominent emotion of the time. The atmosphere in the business world had also become heavy. As energy costs rose, factories began to cut production. Overtime was cancelled, shifts were reduced. Some workers ended up working only a few days a week. They weren't officially considered unemployed, but their earnings had dropped significantly. This created invisible wounds in family budgets. For the first time in old America, many people faced the thought that working alone might not be enough. Inside homes, however, small but meaningful changes were taking place. Heaters were turned down, lights weren't turned on unnecessarily. Families made it a habit to gather in one room in the evenings. This was both for saving money and, unconsciously, a form of solidarity. Those quiet evenings that older Americans talk about today are a legacy of this period. The psychological impact was more lasting than the material impact. People became hesitant to make plans for the future. Decisions like buying a new car, moving house, or starting a business were postponed because no one knew what tomorrow would bring. Although experts on television tried to offer hope, what the average person felt was uncertainty. This uncertainty was like a long shadow falling over the American dream. Another change in society occurred in the sense of trust. The state's energy policies, the profits of large corporations, and global relations began to be questioned. The question, "Why are we so vulnerable?" was being asked more frequently. Old America was accustomed to feeling powerful and in control. This crisis showed the exact opposite. A revolution in a distant country could turn the lives of millions upside down. Children growing up during this period learned the value of energy at an early age. They learned to think twice before getting in the car, to turn off the lights, and to be content with what they had. Many older Americans still trace the origins of these habits back to 1979-80. Because this crisis was not just an economic event, but a generational experience, and perhaps most importantly, the second oil crisis was a harbinger of the larger economic storm that would erupt in the early 1980s. Rising inflation, increasing interest rates, and borrowing pressure were slowly accumulating. At the time, no one could quite put a name to it, but everyone felt something was getting heavier. Old America changed quietly during these years. The queues eventually ended and prices eventually stabilized, but the caution that had developed among people didn't disappear for long. Because the 1979-80 crisis had taught Americans this: abundance is not permanent, and in a world interconnected by invisible bonds, trust can be shaken at any moment. This crisis showed Americans that energy is not just a resource, but a fragile balance at the heart of life. Even when the gas lines disappeared, the uncertainty in people's minds lingered long afterward. The second oil crisis of 1979-80 quietly eroded the sense of security of an era. Many families carried the saving habits they learned in those years throughout their lives. Older Americans alive today still remember those days clearly. The helplessness they felt while waiting in those lines eventually turned into a warning. For the first time, they realized that an event in another corner of the world could affect the light in their homes. This crisis taught that abundance is not guaranteed, and perhaps the most enduring lesson was this: a society caught unprepared can be shaken even at its strongest. The second oil crisis remains an indelible mark on the memory of old America. Thanks for listening. See you in the next video.